About a month ago, we told you that the winter months are great times to come in and do any kind of renovation projects, like maybe improving ground beds or building raised beds. Well, that's what we're doing here on the south side of our studio gardens, where we call it our expansion area, and we're actually making some improvements there. We're going to be putting in some ground beds under some of our shade trees for some shade-loving perennials that we'll do some segments on next year. But we're spending a lot of time in the bed preparation, and the first thing that we did was come in during the late fall and kill out the grass with glyphosate herbicide. And the second thing we did, which is very important, is to take a soil test, and we've got those results back now, and it looks like we're going to have to make some changes. Well, we've been getting a lot of questions, as well as county extension offices, about how to interpret soil test results. Well, to help answer these questions, we visited with soil extension specialist Dr. Gordon Johnson, who talks to us about soil testing and how to interpret those results.
This laboratory is often referred to as the Central Laboratory, and it's located here at the OSU campus. It's a laboratory that receives all the samples from the county extension offices for anyone living in the county that wants soil tested. We test samples for farmers that are producing cultivated crops, and also, as we're interested in today, we test a lot of soils from homeowners that are concerned about the soil in their lawn or garden. The menu of tests is fairly complete to cover the kinds of problems that a homeowner or a farmer or rancher may encounter. But basically, there is one test that we refer to as our routine test that satisfies the testing needs of most people. And that test analyzes the soil for its pH, whether it's acid or basic, available nitrogen in the nitrate form, and then an index of available phosphorus and potassium. And if there are deficiencies in any of these areas, usually when they're taken care of, that will eliminate any soil fertilizer nutrient problems. We have a special soil sample bag that's available in each county office, and it's a white bag that you will hold about a pint of soil. You've covered or will cover how to get a sample, and once that sample's been obtained and put in the bag and the drawstring is pulled tight, then it's important to fill out this yellow tag on the bag. We call it our information tag, to identify first of all the kind of test that should be run. And if an X is put in this first box, that's for the routine test. That tells the laboratory that on this sample the homeowner wants a routine test run. And to identify that it's from a homeowner, there's an area over on the far right side of the tag that identifies a homeowner. Two different conditions that we have calibrations for. One is the gardener, or for the home garden, so they could put an X there, or for a lawn, they could put an X next to the lawn. After the soil is tested, then the results are printed out on a soil test report form, similar to what I have here. The results are printed in this line up here, and then below that is printed an interpretation. Now, the only time the interpretation is printed is if the laboratory knows what crop or what growing situation is involved. For a homeowner, it'll be a lawn or a garden. So if lawn or garden is identified on the tag, then an interpretation will be printed. If there's no identification of lawn or garden, then this area will be blank, and someone in the county office will make the interpretation for that sample. We, at this time, do not have calibrations that identify relationship between the soil test value and the deficiency or the amount of nutrient that should be applied for roses, azaleas, tree crops, or individual trees. We don't have those identified yet, and so we're limited to just making general interpretations for a lawn or for a general garden. In looking at a lot of different soil test results for homeowners, I've been led to conclude that there are two times when a soil test, I think, is helpful to the homeowner. And in the first case, I think it's very helpful to identify that annual applications of fertilizer are no longer needed. We recognize that some fertilizer materials accumulate in the soil, and if they're applied each year, finally a point is reached where the soil is built up to where you don't need to apply it anymore. And this first soil test report is a good example of that. And as I go through the soil test results here, I'll call attention to the numbers that we would like to see. pH, of course, is a measure of whether the soil is acid or basic. We'd like to see it for the garden somewhere between 6 and 7.5, but there's no real magical number that everyone should try to have. Somewhere in that range is desirable. This number here for nitrogen, in this case it shows 32. We'd like to see a number of about 40 there. 40, this is pounds per acre, would relate to 1 pound per 1,000 square feet. And that's a good starting point for a lawn or a garden. I like to use the analogy of nitrogen to fuel in the car. And this is a half a tank. You know, it'll get you started and let you go in any direction, so long as you're prepared to add some along the way if you decide to make a long trip. So 40 pounds here, or 1 pound per 1,000 square feet, is a good starting point, and then during the season that can be supplemented if necessary. The next analysis in the laboratory is for phosphorus, and here we'd like to see a number of 65. Phosphorus does accumulate in the soil, and often we find very high numbers here as a result of annual use of 10-20-10, where a little bit of nitrogen is added and a lot of phosphorus is added. Phosphorus isn't used in nearly as high amounts as nitrogen, so it accumulates in the soil. Here we have 3 times as much phosphorus as necessary. So again, if we would draw on that analogy of nitrogen being like fuel, we would consider phosphorus like oil. And a value of 215 is like having the crankcase full and a couple 55-gallon barrels in the trunk. So there's plenty here for 10 or 15 years. Likewise, the potassium level of nearly 700 here is at least twice as high as it needs to be. And so no potassium would be required for many years. What that means is that this homeowner, having tested the soil now, needs only to monitor by visual symptoms nitrogen needs, and then address those needs by either adding just a little bit of nitrogen as a surface top dress, or perhaps just cultivating or hoeing the soil around the plants to stimulate release of organic nitrogen, and discontinue that annual spring or fall application of 10-20-10 or some other fertilizer. This next example identifies the other case, where oftentimes a homeowner has a new home on what we'd call virgin soil. There is no history of gardening or use of fertilizers, and so the nutrient levels in this soil may be very low. And without a soil test, the homeowner may struggle for several years trying to get a lawn established or trying to have a nice garden and be unsuccessful with it. This soil test identifies that the pH is all right, the nitrogen is very low, 3, so the tank is really empty. Phosphorus is 11, so they're down about 3 quarts of oil. There's just a little bit in the crankcase there, and they need quite a bit. And then potassium is also very low, so they need all 3 of those primary nutrients. Nitrogen, the interpretation shows us here 1 pound per 1,000 square feet, 2.5 pounds per 1,000 square feet for phosphorus, and 5 pounds per 1,000 square feet for potassium. So this area has been identified through the use of soil testing as having some very special needs as far as fertilizer requirements. It's tough to have a best advice, but I guess I would summarize what I've said here in that the first thing I think to do is to get a soil test. Find out where you're at from the standpoint of nutrient needs. And then having received that soil test, now you can make some rational decisions about whether or not and how much to fertilize. So again, it goes back to the analogy of having a car and servicing a car. Would you run that car without ever checking the fuel gauge or eliminating a fuel gauge and a dipstick, and simply every day pull up to a service station and buy so much gas and so much oil and then go on your way. You know, most people wouldn't do that. They would prefer to have the benefit of guidance from that fuel gauge and that dipstick for oil. I think we should use the same rationale in looking at what the garden and the lawn needs. Instead of blindly applying fertilizers every year, we ought to examine chemically what's there, use the soil test, and then make a rational decision.
Well, if you still have questions about your soil interpretation, or you didn't get an interpretation for a particular plant or crop, don't forget to call your county extension office, because they've got a lot of good information to help you answer those questions. Now, on our particular soil test report, our phosphorus and potassium both were very high, so we won't be putting in any phosphorus or potassium, and we won't need to put any lime in some of the different areas for the beds. And our nitrogen was low, but we'll incorporate that at the time or after we plant in our new beds. Now, this particular bed, we are going to put in some acidic type plants right here in the center, and we've marked off 100 square feet where we're going to try some azaleas and different plants that require an acid soil. Now, if you've kept up with some of the segments on Oklahoma Gardening, you know that azaleas really don't do very well this far west, and especially because of our heavy clays. And our soil pH was a 5.8, which isn't too bad for some acidic type plants, but for azaleas we need to drop it down around 5.4 to 5.6, or even below 5.4, maybe around 5.2. So what we're going to have to do, remember to lower the pH, you add sulfur, and that's what I was doing here. Now, we've marked off the 100 square foot, and the recommendations are a pound of sulfur per 100 square feet. So we've measured some out, and remember to wear that dust mask and those gloves because of the dust particles, and you probably don't want to try it on a very windy day like it is today. This is just a 4-pound bag, so it's not really that expensive to lower the pH. Now, if you had a smaller amount, say like 10 square feet, you would convert that over, and it comes out about a pound, and 1.5 ounces. Or if you're going to go up to 1,000 square feet, it would be about 10 pounds of sulfur. So again, it's some good things that you have to do, and you don't want to apply the sulfur, but maybe every 2 months if you should have to lower it some more. So with our application, we should move it from 5.8, dropping it an entire unit, which would be down to 4.8, which really is going to be pretty good for our heavy soils and our conditions that azaleas are going to prefer. Now, the thing that we'll do is we'll work this in, but not only will the sulfur help, but there's some organic type things that we can use and incorporate in these beds too. The first one here is just peat moss, and many of you are familiar with peat moss. It does have a little bit of acidic base to it that you can incorporate and help loosen the soil and make it more viable and drain better. But another thing this time of year that you can find sometimes are pecan hulls, and they're somewhat acidic too, and we'll also use those to mulch with after we get the plants in the ground. So we'll rake those out, put them here in the soil, and it'll give us some good flexibility as well. Now, the other thing over here that is just, gosh, it's so available this time of year are leaves. Now, we've come in and shred ours up a little bit to make it easier to till them in and also to break down quicker. Well, we're getting our leaves from the grounds department here on the OSU campus, and we're just getting mountainfuls of bags of leaves. And again, we can't get enough of the good leaves for the compost and for the ground beds. But in addition to the leaves, we're also putting in some silage topping that we've tilled in very lightly, and that's a key point. Anytime you're planting or working around tree roots, you need to be very careful because the tree roots are in about the top 12 inches of soil. So we're very shallow tilling this, about anywhere from 2 to 4 inches. And that's why we're chopping the leaves up finely, and we're trying to build the beds up so we don't damage any of the tree roots, because the trees are important to the culture of the plants that we put in. Now, I can't emphasize enough how important it is to work these beds up. Many times we go and buy plants and then we try to decide where we're going to put them. And you can tell that we're spending a lot of time, a lot of investment, and a lot of patience to put this together, because once you've got a great soil to work with, the fewer problems you're going to have in the long run. So be patient. Don't forget to work these beds up, especially if you're starting from scratch like we are. And a lot of the things that we're using can be gotten free at this time of year. Well, we're running out of time. As you can see, the sun's going down, and we hope that you'll join us next week here on Oklahoma Gardening.
We hope you enjoyed this video. It's part of our OK Gardening Classics YouTube channel. You can also find more recent videos on our Oklahoma Gardening YouTube channel. And join us on social media for great gardening tips, photos, and discussion.